logically very powerful and politically quite impactful. One is to say we need to move away from notions of ethnic identity towards a cosmopolitan nationalism that recognises there are many different ways to be Burmese, and that you can have many different mixes of cultural experiences that produce individual lives, right? And that we shouldn't be hung up about this. And if Muslims want to marry Buddhists, and if Koreans want to marry Arakanese, that's perfectly fine, right? And you'll just get these melded, complicated cultures growing over time, and things will change as they have always changed. Because remember, the national ethnicities that we currently have are snapshots, sort of in a sense, driven into place by the colonial power at a particular time. Because if you go back in Burmese history, people were, put it mildly, sort of raped and pillaged by kingdoms and invasions from time immemorial. And a friend of mine who's involved in genetic tracking of populations says if you actually do a genetic tracking of most Burmese, there are a total sort of mix of many, many different genetic pathways that have intersected over time. Okay. And thirdly, national leadership is vital, right? I've said there that division lives off reluctant leaders. That is, if the leaders are reluctant to stand up for these sorts of issues, then the dog whistle is heard loud and clear amongst those who want to hear that dog whistle, and chaos and conflict remain. And one of the big questions that has emerged over the last year has been the question of why are we not hearing from Aung San Suu Kyi on these questions? Right? Why was she silent on the Rohingya issues? Why is she not saying anything currently or much in relationship to some of these questions? And we know in the Australian context, when national leaders go silent or give mixed messages, extremism flourishes in those contexts. So that's something we can learn. Okay. So while Australia has in the past asserted human rights, we've not been all that good at it all the time, and we're worse at it for people who we like least. Right? So that is, the people who we think don't deserve human rights, we're less concerned about, and the people we think do deserve human rights, we're really strong about. So we're big on Tibetans, and we're really bad on Muslim boat people. Right? And you can see the way in which that sort of conversation has developed in the Australian context. But because we're a free people and we can reflect on these things, we know the dangers of not having a good human rights argument. And we also need a model of active citizenship that we've sort of mobilised Australia by doing two things. One is we've made naturalisation quite easy in Australia. It's quite easy to become an Australian citizen. In Burma, it's almost impossible to become a Burmese citizen. And even if you thought you were one, you might wake up one day and discover you're not. So there are those sorts of issues. And we've also made dual citizenship legal. In Burma, that's a criminal offence. Right? So there are some big questions about how one might want to move on some of this stuff. So finally, it's going to work. Yes, there we go. Hey, okay. So some possible ways forward and to finalise this. One of the key things I think we're really looking at now is the challenge of the Myanmar citizenship laws and how they're going to operate. It's fairly clear that they have to be reconstructed in order to assert an equality of citizenship. Right? At the moment, the citizenship laws are constructed partly in order to support a federation of nationalities model and partly to support a indigenous essentialist model. And they don't do very much for a lot of people, but in particular, they make life extremely difficult for the Rohingya. And we'll probably have a big debate about that question about one of the issues is what does it mean to say Rohingya are Burmese? And what model do you need? Secondly, there clearly needs to be something happening around the National Human Rights Code that both protects ethnic identity and religious beliefs, but also, I said here, secularises the state. Now, India has done that in a very interesting way. Right? unlike Pakistan. India has a secular constitution. That doesn't mean it's an atheistic constitution. It means that India says, if you want to follow a particular religion, you can do so, and it makes you no more or less an Indian to be that. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't forces in India that would say you've got to be Hindu to be really Indian. But the Indian state constitution, which actually holds the thing together more or less in this extraordinary maelstrom of human beings, says you can be anything you want, and in India there are many things people want to be, right? And as long as you accept everybody else can do that, then that makes you Indian. Your capacity to both be what you want to be and accept other people's rights to be what they want to be is what defines the essence of being an Indian within this particular context. In Myanmar, that is not the case, and that is something that needs to be, seems to me to be resolved. Thirdly, the process of how you build a national identity, which I think depends on these earlier two, becomes really important. That is the capacity to build a sense of being a Myanmar citizen that can sit comfortably with national ethnic identities, religious identities as well. And for some groups that is very difficult. For instance, for people who follow a global sense of what Islam means and who feel that national boundaries and national borders are create an oppositional problem for Muslims, this is an issue. For those Muslims who don't see that as a problem, it's not an issue. And inside the politics of Myanmar, as in Australia, that's an important question. And the final bit, I guess, which is really at the heart of a lot of this, is the economic development issues. A lot of the drive towards democracy and so on that we're currently seeing in Myanmar is a consequence of the huge economic opportunities there are now. Oil, timber, potential electrical power, hydropower, gems, many rare earth, like it's just enormous. And ASEAN has sketched in a number of development corridors running from Myanmar into Cambodia, into Laos, up into Thailand, up into China. And the pressure to make Myanmar a place that is safe to do business in is enormous. But at the same time, many of the national groups are very scared that the economic opportunities that should be part of a democratic economic development program are going to disappear, to be taken by the old regime, the generals, their cronies, and that they'll be squeezed and pressed. And indeed, one of these issues is being played out at the moment in near Mandalay in central Burma around the whole issue of new coal mines and what's going to happen there and what impact that will have on traditional ways of doing agriculture and so on. Okay, so I really want to leave it there because I've been rabbiting on for a bit too long. We've got about 20 minutes, I think, for discussion, and I'm happy to take questions or hear conversations from people.
I think what we'd like to do initially is maybe take questions that are relevant to the presentation. So if there's anyone who'd like to start off by asking a question that's quite relevant, please raise your hand and we'll have it presented. Yes, sir.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, good to see you.
You talked about the multiculturalism. Do you think that would be the way forward for Burma, or do you think because the dominant culture over there is so strong that you might need to consider assimilation of some of the subculture and the sub-ethnic group? I think like in America and that part of the world, they kind of implemented that assimilation model rather than multiculturalism model that we used to hear. Any opinion on that?
Yeah, I think that notion of at one end multiculturalism, which is everybody's equal and it doesn't matter what you are, versus a unitary state, is actually not a fair comparison. There are no multicultural societies in which every group is equal and different. Right? It just doesn't exist, because then you don't have a society. There has to be at least one framework of legal structures and what you call it, reciprocity of respect. People have to accept that they're part of a whole, and that being part of that whole means other people are part of that story as well. So in the Australian context, that's really what multiculturalism means. Because nobody in Australia says what we should have is lots of communities with their own territories, running their own lives according to their own laws. Right? I mean, we've been very careful in Australia to say, no, that's not the case. But we balance it. Right? Some things we allow communities to run more or less, particularly around things like religious practices, many forms of civil engagement and so on. So that works all right, it seems to me. And that's the sort of model, a bit more intense, I would guess it would be the best way for somewhere like Myanmar to go. But you've got a problem to some extent because the way the country is structured, you have these, you have the states like Shan states, Chin state, and so on, which are really ethno-nationalist areas with minorities in them, but not a lot of people who aren't from those groups. And then you've got regions which are mainly Burma with minorities in them. The challenge is to ensure that where you have majoritarian local governments, they are committed to the rights of minorities within their areas. And that's almost the big challenge wherever you are. And it seems to me that that's the area that Burma or Myanmar is going to have to work on most intensely, because that's the area that can break up so easily. Right? It doesn't take much to make that stuff go crazy, right? As we've seen, because at the edges of every community, there are people who feel extraordinarily passionate about the purity of what they believe in, and that is the truth. And they believe that they and they alone are the defenders of the faith in one form or another, whatever that faith is, and that everyone else is selling out, and therefore the only way that you can have the proper pathway is to destroy the opposition and force everyone to follow you. Right? And we've seen that occur in countries like Afghanistan. And the difficulty, the danger is of that sort of view of the world spreading. And I think one of the interesting challenges here, as in Myanmar, is having people from the various Myanmar communities talking to each other here about what they can learn from Australia and send back into the Myanmar environment. Because you only have to go on YouTube or onto the internet or Facebook, and you'll see how particularly young people who play in the internet are vicious about each other, right? Really vicious, nasty, horrible stuff, right? And that can very quickly turn into something much more dangerous, as it has done. And I think also the other thing that's become clear in the Myanmar situation is that the local authorities really don't know how to deal with any of this. They've been beaten over the head for being militaristic and shooting people in the past. Right? So they're standing back. There's one report I was reading that said in the latest struggle, local police officers were standing round, not quite knowing what to do because they hadn't had any orders and they had no experience of how to work without orders. So chaos was around them. In the past, they would have got a gun, shot some people and made it just stop. Right? They're not allowed to do that anymore. So they don't do anything. So people kill each other. Right? So there's a whole thing about the police learning, but even in Australia, that's an issue. Right? It was really only last year, for the first time, that we saw the close liaison between the New South Wales police and the various Muslim community leaders over the uprising conflicts that occurred in Hyde Park in September. I mean, that was actually quite a critical moment because for the first time you had police and community leaders standing together making a public statement that says, whatever that is, that's not us, right? That's extreme.